Okay, we started recording. So me and Boris are going to share a little bit about the cross connection between the cultures, and Boris has a lot of experience with the spiritual STEAM traditions from the Eurasia mostly, but he also had experience in other parts of the world, and also quite an extended experience with the Amazonian Shipibo tradition and also in the Tibetan Dzogchen. And there are quite a few parallels with the work that we are doing. So the spiritual STEAM has not been the main part of my work, although I have been engaging with it as a hobby quite a lot over the years, and mainly also the Amazonian tradition from other tribes, from the Yagua, Ashuar, and Mestizo, Witoto, and then also the Indian tradition and also the Tibetan tradition from the Mahamudra lineage. And so there's quite a few parallels between our work, and I find a lot of parallels between the spiritual STEAM traditions and also the sacred plant medicine traditions that we are working with. And so today we'll share a little bit about that, and also the practical ways that people can implement that in their everyday life. And Boris has a lot of experience within that, and he works a lot with people from all around the world that are involved in the spiritual STEAM tradition. So I'll let Boris share a little bit more about that. So share a bit about your experience and the work that you're doing, Boris.
Yeah, well, thank you, Roman, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to have this discussion between Roman, my friend, and myself. So, and like having a chance to have a discussion between all of us here, present here. As Roman mentioned, I represent Steamology Institute, and we are learning and teaching organization and as well a research organization around contemporary STEAM, but as well traditional STEAM. And in many respects, what we are working with is developing an understanding of what it actually means to make use of healing STEAM for us contemporary people. And on the other hand, at the same time, it has so many connections to traditional knowledge, and it weaves into the spiritual traditions all around the world, in Tibet, in Andes, in Northern America, in Eurasia, in Celtic traditions, which are now extinct. There were multiple instances of STEAM being used as one of the most ancient ceremonial vehicle of transformation and of trance induction. So that's what we are doing, and it's a big thing for me to have a chance to have this discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Boris, for being with us here. And right before our talk started, one of my favorite things to do is contrast bathing. So I like to take hot and cold showers and finish with the cold. And after that, I actually feel often effects that are similar to when I engage with ayahuasca ceremony. So I have like the tingling, the vibration all over the body. I feel much more invigorated and alive. And I find that it's quite parallel across traditions. Also with the hot and cold, I find that there is not just the physical experience, but there is a spiritual experience that takes place, and it's very much connected with the body. So also in the ceremonies, I find sometimes going through hot and cold waves and sweating, and I find that it's a similar physiological effect to what happens in the ceremonies, and something that everyone can do at home. And then of course it's just, you know, dipping the toes in the water, so to speak. And there's a lot more to these traditions, but that's something that everyone can experience in their own environment.
Pretty much so. Yeah, if you consider the first evolutionary step for the for our species was to go from the wetlands of Africa into more temperate climates, and basically making use of fire and making use of steam would be perhaps what made us capable of surviving in colder climates. So pretty much evolutionary vehicle.
Yeah, I find that when I do that, I'm not so sensitive to the cold anymore, and there is the inner heat that is awakened. And this is something that also part of this spiritual process. And today I see that people are doing it with the Wim Hof breath, which I believe also was borrowed a lot from pranayama tradition. And it's this coupling of the breath and the hot and the cold environment, and then awakening the body's inner potential.
Yeah, well, and again, in many respects, the ability of us managing our inner heat has very deep and understandable physiological foundation in hypothalamus function of basically managing the brainstem and managing a number of functions which usually are outside of the scope of our awareness. And once we start to tap into that, in many respects, it opens up a potentiality which is already there to become aware of more subtle processes happening in the body, not just in the body as well. So it's pretty much the easiest accessible tool for doing that. And of course, coupling this with breathing makes it available like wherever you go, whenever you need it. So yeah, breathing comes together with the sensation of heat.
Also, I find interesting parallels in the Amazon, for example. The traditions that I studied with, they relate cold to fear. And sometimes there is this cold that comes from the inside, no matter how many blankets you put, even in the tropical Amazon, and you still feel cold sometimes, right? And they relate the cold to fear, the deep-seated fear. And then the heat is related to more heated emotions like anger. And then to balance the two together, which basically means to relate to those emotions within one's being, and then fear can transform into deep discernment and observation, and then the anger can transform into determination. And so in a way, it also is a way to engage with the emotions and feelings within the organism.
Yeah, I found as well several connotations of the balance between cold and hot. And basically, most of the traditions, like you take Taoist tradition, you take Ayurvedic tradition, you take pretty much all Temescal and Ipi traditions, you will see that the concept of heat and coldness has a much broader cosmological connotation, to the extent that plants have the essence of heat and essence of cold. Some plants have essence of heat and some plants have essence of cold. Diseases have essence of heat and essence of cold, like in Tibetan medicine, of course, that's one of the things. But from the ceremonial perspective, in Shipibo way, for example, that's one of the things we learn as practitioners when we start to discern the false light as opposed to real light in our visions. Like false light has this absence of heat, so that it allows to discern, so that you can actually see that what you're seeing, the visions you've got, are coming from the false light rather than from the real light, and that there are a couple of things related to that. And some diagnostics comes from the same angle as well. Like, for example, as you're mentioning, the sensation of cold. Say diagnosing susto, like losing a part of soul, as the widespread syndrome, as described in Amazonian traditions, is associated often with the sensation of coldness in parts of the body or in the body in general. In many traditions, we would see that heat, a particular aspect of heat, is basically a synonym of life itself. Being alive means being able to balance heat, and it's one of the most profound experiences we see in many medicinal traditions.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating to balance the two together, and then to balance the two together, there has to be a relationship developed. So then one needs to experience the two extremes in a way, to find the middle between them. So to get to know the cold and the hot, and then to find the balance between the two, because both are essential in our lives and in our bodies. And so that's quite fascinating how the different cultures and traditions, they bring the two together. And then another part of it that I find quite fascinating is the alchemical process, right? So that when the heat rises or when the cold rises, and it's possible to maintain awareness, and then there is a certain alchemical process that takes place where the conditioned part of us cannot deal with those extremes. And then there has to be a greater purpose, awakened to life.
I think that's one of the really important topics. Once we consider that there is a healing process which has this connotation of helping particular energies go through the body. If you take like spiritual healing or energetic healing, in steam traditions, it's gonna be connected with the moving the sensation of heat, basically as a representation of energy running through the channels, as well as basically applying heat or coldness physically to particular points of the body, which is again represented in many contemporary, even like Western approaches to physiotherapy. That's one thing. Healing doesn't really involve awareness of those who are being healed, but once awareness is pointed towards that, the healing becomes way more profound, because at that very moment, potentiality of self-healing starts to kick in, because once we become aware of what's going on within us, it opens up an opportunity for knowledge to be connected to our physical sensations. And basically then it becomes something bigger than just being healed. It becomes something of learning. And by learning, I think we are tapping more and more into the potentiality, again, the already present potentiality of us as human beings to learn what healing means and what health means for ourselves, and basically to be healers for ourselves. And I think this is the biggest difference between contemporary Western medicine approach, where you just like take a pill and that's it, without actually realizing what's going on, and ancient healing ways, when attention of the person being healed is basically directed towards what's going on. If it is applied properly, then it becomes a medicine for the mind as well, not just for the body.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I find that it's really disconnecting, no longer identifying the sensation with the story in our head. And that reminds me of a story with a dear Lakota friend. He's been adopted into the Lakota Nation over 30 years ago, I think. And we were having a San Pedro ceremony in the snow in the winter. And he's used to the sweat lodge, right? And he's, an amazing healer in the sweat lodge, and also does the vision quests and sun dances. And in that particular experience, we were walking around in the snow, and then we found a big pine tree, and we sat around there, and we were sitting there and singing, invoking the sacred songs. And at a certain point, my Lakota friend, he came over to me, and he told me that he's very cold. And then I looked at him and I said, well, this is the same as sweat lodge, only cold. And that became a private joke between us since then. He says, oh yeah, it's the same as sweat lodge, only cold. And that really clicked for him then, because he's used to, going into a sweat lodge and being in extreme heat. And he's developed a relationship with that. But then with the other extreme, with the cold, he needed to develop that relationship and approach. Essentially, it's energy, whether it's hot or cold, and how we interpret that energy, how we engage with it, how much we allow that energy to move through our being. And I know people who've been living in extreme cold environment, like in Alaska or Siberia, for example, and it's considered to be able to survive that kind of intense cold where it's like extreme minus degrees, then one has to be completely relaxed, right? So if there's like this kind of like shaking and squeezing, the body loses the heat a lot faster than if the individual is relaxed. So I find that quite fascinating, this development of a relationship and engagement as energy, rather than making a story about it in one's head.
I think that what really makes the application of heat and cold so interesting as a method and as a tool. And once we consider that it allows interpretation and discovery on so many different levels, like physiologically, we can have a very precise interpretation of what's going on, like what happens with the relaxation, what happens to the fascia and myofascial systems, and what happens with the nervous system, what happens with cardiovascular system. So like there is a lot of good explanation what's going on. But at the same time, it allows us to have a very specific and very direct interpretation in terms of energy, and from whatever healing system we actually from whatever angle we want to take, be it traditional Tibetan medicine, energy work, or other traditions, but as well from the most innermost spiritual perspective, we have as well this idea of connection and of communication with the spirit of heat, so to say, and with the vision which is associated with it, and this multi-layered nature or multi-layered potentiality for interpretation makes it very helpful, because then it allows us to bridge the ancient ways with contemporary science, basically decreasing the gap between the worldviews. And I think, again, it's quite helpful from the perspective of how we approach working with entheogens and with plant medicine, because there having the whole tool set of interpretations allows us to create allies in the contemporary science world, which is basically what I think world needs right now, so that we can actually listen to each other. Those who are working in traditional ways, those who are working in contemporary ways, we better start listening to each other, because otherwise it will be always somewhat antagonistic.
Yeah, I find that bridge between the spiritual traditions and the modern science also to be very helpful, and not to diminish one or the other, but to find more objective perspectives. And it's quite interesting. I think there are now different studies, especially with the Wim Hof movement, and show how cold can invigorate the immune system and make us more healthy. And then there's also the spiritual traditions from Tibet, from the Dumo practice, for example, the inner heat, which then they go up in the snow in the mountains and have competitions who's going to dry the most wet blankets that are turning into the ice and sitting there naked. And I find that the heat or the drying of the wet blankets is the secondary aspect or side effect. But the main approach is really this development of deeper relationship with the energy of the organism, and how cold can actually encourage that inner heat. And the inner heat is also how you mentioned within the Shipibo tradition, with the true light that is connected with the warmth, and that's the light of the heart. And so then to engage all of those adverse environments and energies in them as a way to awaken the heart, and transforming that light of the heart, the love for all beings, into the intense heat within the most cold environment. So it's again this process of transcending the self-absorption in a way, not just kind of being in fear and self-survival mode, but this care for the greater whole that eliminates the danger of freezing to death. So it's quite fascinating how it's connected.
Yeah, and then taking, for example, the application of Tumo, that's one of the subjects I want to draw on. Again, what it shows me is that once we see Tumo methods being applied in contemporary world, there is as well an opportunity of misinterpretation by taking the Tumo out of the context and placing this as just a method to feel hot, whatever it is. So making sort of championships out of that, as if it was the sole purpose. Then on one end, we can say it is disrespectful towards the tradition, but in the essence, the real problem is the worldview. Now, the worldview being a realization that it's not just body which does exist, and therefore, if we assume that there is more than body which does exist, and there is a deeper level of understanding of what's going on, once we apply Dharma, for example, then the whole symbolic nature of sun and moon, of fire and coldness opens up. The wisdom of our inner nature opens up by seeing beyond just the body, and even more say, like if you take traditional depictions of Buddhist deities in Tibetan Buddhism, we see wrathful deities being surrounded by fire, and peaceful deities being surrounded by neutral temperature. So basically, it's as well a symbol of our energy, of the way we manifest our energy. So once we drill down towards that, it becomes way more than just a method. And in a sense, the symbolics of heat and cold shows us an example of how we can transcend the materialistic worldview. And it is as true for the heat and cold as it is true for understanding the plants and understanding that it's not just a substance, a molecule, a particular psychoactive something. It's way more than that. It's a connection to something which is way more ancient, way more important, way more knowledgeable than any chemical substance can be. So by seeing through this lens, by observing these methods through this lens, and by practicing them, paying respect to the tradition and traditional interpretation, I think we can learn how to see more of what the of what the essence of human being really is through an actual practice, not just through intellectual understanding, not just through reading books of this tradition or that tradition, because otherwise they just stay stories. But by seeing into the phenomenological, into the phenomenology of heat, cold, plants, and practicing that diligently and respectfully, we can have a way more specific and concrete understanding of what the traditions are actually talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that to be very essential, is to actually, I mean, I find that the theory and the practice go hand in hand. So the practice without the theory is not going to get very far, and the theory without the practice is also meaningless. And then, of course, this theme of the spiritual bypass, where people engage, whether in sweat lodge or sauna or the plant medicines, more as a spiritual bypass to experience some effects, but without connecting it to the greater process of one's life. And I find that also to be very essential in today's world, and we spoke about that with you before. We cannot just follow someone else's way without making it relevant in our own lives and in our own world today. And some people today, they're trying to basically imitate or try to become like the people used to be in ancient times, but then lose the connection to today's world. And then instead, to make it relevant and to make it meaningful and to see how we can approach it in a way that allows our spirit to awaken, that allows our potential to come forth, instead of just going through the motions of it or trying to mimic or imitate without being real with ourselves and the life that we are living. And so I find that that is also very essential, not to lose the context, right? Like what you were mentioning, just to go for the effects of it, or just to feel better about oneself, but without actually making it into an inner journey, and then get to know oneself, transform one's own limitations and adversities, make more sense of what is happening inside, and then in a way to actually link it with everyday life. So yeah, I can go into the sweat lodge, or I can go into a ceremony, and I can have some kind of a mind-blowing experience with all kinds of revelations. And then I turn around and I completely forget about it, and I wait for the next sensational experience. But then there's no steady pace happening in everyday life. And to my understanding, these traditions were meant actually to be as a certain blueprint for the discipline in everyday life. And then, like what you were talking about, connecting at first to those extremes in a more physical sense, but then relating that on a more consciousness level. And then starting to see in everyday life, I experience the hot and the cold when I get very upset and triggered about something, or when I become depressed, or when I freeze in fear, right? It's kind of like that dream language, right? We still express it in our today's language. I either freeze in fear, or I become enraged with flames. And so then how do I continue developing that balance in my everyday life?
Yeah, well, I mean, from my perspective, it really boils down to the usual tendency of Western mind. Oh, and by saying Western, I don't really mean just West, but rather contemporary mind, industrial mind, so to say, to get used to be a consumer of experiences. So without taking responsibility for basically learning what the process of experiencing is. And this responsibility, if assumed properly, makes us as well responsible for learning how to sense, what the consciousness of sensation is, and what the process of learning how to be attentive is, what the process of remembrance is, and how to be actually willing to become knowledgeable about all that. So turning from consumption of experiences into the research and self-inquiry can become an arduous path, and of course it's not something what can be learned overnight, because basically most of us haven't been taught that at school or wherever else, because it wasn't needed in industrial society. But the thing is, we are not living in industrial society anymore. At least most of the countries don't live in industrial society anymore. So we are running into a society which is working with an overflow of information and overflow of experiences. And the problem is how to make sense of that, and how to make sense of what the human being is. So we need to learn the skills, and to do that, we need to become more investigative about the process of cognition and sensation itself. So in that respect, learning about a tradition becomes something of research, and trying to run a thermal experience or working with entheogens becomes the real issue becomes how to learn how to communicate with this experience. And the knowledge of communication really requires an alteration of our worldview, so that we actually start to learn how to communicate with the outside world, with the plants, with the nature of steam, with the nature of heat, and basically with our own real nature. So otherwise we never get to understand what's going on. And this requires humbleness of a student. And again, it requires as well the process of teaching and learning to be present within a particular ceremony or a particular experience, because without that it just becomes an attempt to mimic a cultural phenomenon, which is not there anymore, because we are always creating culture. We can't really transfer culture or mimic culture without losing the essence. We need to create it, we need to remember it, and this is an active process, very creative process, and requires participation of everyone involved, be it a guest or a facilitator, whoever it might be.
Yeah, you mentioned the remembrance process, and that's also something that goes across cultures, is this original natural state. This memory, and it's not just the conceptual knowledge, but the embodiment of that. And that requires practice and perseverance as you mentioned. And so then it's this ability to channel intensity and coming out of the consumerist mind, where we consider ourselves to be the masters of this creation. And you mentioned with the, we're in post-industrial world where we are experiencing actually the effects of that consumerist mentality, where the ecosystem is collapsing around the world. And there's all kinds of climatic changes that are occur. And that reminds me of an ancient Taoist saying that there is no external evil without an inner disbalance first. And so it's this, right now, for example, in the Andes, we're experiencing severe drought. It was supposed to be raining already like 2 months ago. And we're having sprinkles only now, just starting. And actually, I've been seeing how there's been like the Pleistocene era where there was similar climate changes around the world, and then that actually caused like 1,000-year drought here in the Andes, and now they're estimating that possibly it will happen again, and it's the result again of like a lot of kind of carbon being dumped into the atmosphere, and there's nothing being sequestered. And then our civilization is all about the heat, and we've been using the internal engine combustion and burning the oil, which is also the remnants of ancient biology that is present in the earth. And I liked this metaphor that it's kind of like the exhumation of the dead god. That we're digging out all of the oil reserves, and then they're being expelled into the atmosphere, making the god alive. And at the same time, it's this transformation through fire that is happening around the world, but not in a very conscious way. And so then within the ancient traditions and with this team, developing a healing relationship with the fire that can humble us and bring us into the original natural state of well-being. And it's also present in the indigenous traditions. In the Amazon, my teacher shared with me this process of remembrance, remembering that original childlike state. In the Andes also, it's the children of the sun. The sun represents the heat of consciousness that is able to inseminate the earth. And again, it's that yin and yang, the hot and the cold. And then the alchemical transformation that happens through that by allowing ourselves to be channels, not to be the masters of this world, but to be a part, a conscious part of this whole ecosystem, and seeing how the outer is affected by the inner state of the whole humanity, the whole human civilization. And then, of course, it comes down to the critical mass consciousness of people who can actually lead the way and establish that pathway for humanity to remember. And then they have the rocks as the grandfathers or grandmothers in the Temazcal tradition, and sharing that wisdom with the world, how we can bring that heat into our hearts rather than just having it in our minds, and then overheating with our heads, and then remaining cold in our hearts.
Yeah, pretty much so. So to me, it really speaks to the same topic of communication, but in a much deeper way than we used to think about it, and again in contemporary world, because then whatever tradition you take speaks of communication in a much more profound way, not just conceptually stating that the human being is part of ecosystem, because it so often remains just a conceptual thought, like what what it means to be part of ecosystem. If we have learned through the last like 400 years that human being is the pinnacle of creation, what it means to be part of ecosystem without really changing this understanding. So, but practically it means that we have to learn to communicate between ourselves first, so that the other human being is being perceived as worthy of being connected to, and I think that's was being reflected in Bodhisattva way in Buddhism, for example. Once we really start to understand that there is no point for enlightenment for oneself without realizing that every sentient being needs to be understood of an indispensable part of this world, including myself. And therefore we are all going through the same path, otherwise it doesn't work. So from this perspective, what I really value in properly understood and practiced traditions of plants and traditions of steam is the communal aspect. Once we are vulnerable together, sharing the same journey and sharing the same activity of compassion and support, and learning about what it means to communicate and what it means to be together, this becomes a practice vehicle for us being together in the default world, to integrate this in everyday life, which then makes the Bodhisattva vow something of reality, and then which then makes it really a community in real sense. So I think I value it even more than individual healing process. Of course, individual healing process is important, but we can cleanse forever. You know, like people come to ceremonies, they cleanse forever. They cleanse and cleanse and cleanse and cleanse, and it never ends. But once we start to learn how to communicate to the closest human being, like to our spouses, to our kids, to our parents, then it starts to be something of practical importance. And I think this is the most profound teaching, to not let it stay at the intellectual level.
Yeah, and just to clarify for our audience, the Bodhisattva path is basically dedicating oneself to the well-being of everyone, including oneself. And then there is this part of the Bodhisattva path is that I cannot really be of benefit to others if I'm confused and disturbed myself. And so then it's really this interconnectedness where I can only benefit others if I can make sense of myself. And I can start making sense of myself once I start being of benefit to others. And that's both in the indigenous traditions in the Amazon, the Andes, in the Buddhist traditions, there is the Sangha. In the Northern Native American tradition, there is the all my relations, right? So including that. And then engaging with those experiences of facing oneself, but in a group setting, and then seeing how I am going through these challenges, other people are going through their challenges, and then we're all going through the same universal process, each in our own unique way. And then we can learn from each other and support each other in that. And you mentioned being vulnerable in each other's eyes, and the real healing happens through that. And so I find that to be very meaningful. In all these ancient traditions, there is the community, the healing circle, the spiritual family, the tribe. And then at the same time, each person is facing themselves individually, and everyone are encouraging each other to do that. So it's like we become a community where each one of us is facing ourselves. Otherwise, it also becomes kind of like this spiritual fashion show. And definitely it's good to watch out for, just engaging with the technique without making it relevant to one's own real challenges in everyday life. So Boris, I want to leave some space for people to
Of course.
share some questions, but we are just touching the surface today, and we are planning to have more talks on this subject. So this is just an introduction. As you can see, there is quite a lot in that. And I'm going to go through some questions that people have already asked here. And some of them we've already answered, like you mentioned roles of heat and cold. Is there a particular role in steam in the traditions you mentioned in Peru? So in Peru, in my experience, it's happening more through the sacred plant medicines. And as I mentioned, people sometimes in ceremonies, both with the main plant medicines that we work with in our institute are ayahuasca and wachuma or San Pedro and coca leaves. And actually, all of those plant medicines, they are known to have heating qualities on the physical level. But then because the plants are entheogens, they're sacred plant medicines, they can also tap into the cold in our organism. And sometimes the heat actually helps to bring out the deep-seated cold. And that's why in the ceremonies, sometimes people are experiencing a lot of cold, and it's the same as in fever. The person is feeling a lot of cold, but actually the body is hot. So there is a certain process of expelling the cold that is taking place with the heat. Or sometimes in the steam traditions I've experienced with the hot and cold, where after the cold I go and I do a cold plunge, and then I feel hot as a result of that. Or sometimes, experiencing such intense heat that it becomes scalding. And the experience of it, when it gets very, very hot and scalding, the sensation as if it's cold, as if it's extreme cold. And then the same with extreme cold, it starts to feel like hot, like heat, and can even leave burn in the body, right? So that's quite interesting how with the sacred plant medicines, it starts to connect more on the level of emotions and feelings and the different energies as they come through on a psychological level, and then the body starts to experience it on the physical. So there's that connection, the psychosomatic connection between the hot and the cold. And then, of course, we mentioned with Boris the classification of illnesses in ancient healing traditions, how some illnesses are connected to coldness, or sometimes they have these classifications in the 5-element Taoist system, where it's the damp heat invading the body and causes illness. Or sometimes it's the dry cold, or the damp cold, or the damp heat. And so there's all kinds of imbalances that happen in our body through the fire and water. And then that affects us on the emotional level, and then it comes through on the physical level. Sometimes it can begin on the physical level and come through on the emotional level. Then also I've experienced the sweat lodge in the Native American tradition. So we have an elder in Mexico who's part of a Mazatec tradition, and they do the sweat lodges in combination with peyote sometimes, which is another sacred plant medicine. And the Lakota elders that I've had also, they engage with the inipi, with the sweat lodge together with peyote, and I've experienced that with Henry Red Cloud, the chief of the Red Cloud Lakota clan. And they have a lot of respect and honor, both for the sacred plant medicine and for the heat, where the heat is not engaged as in a consumerist way, where we just think that we can dominate heat and use it for things that are not really essential for our inner evolution. And it's the same with the rocks in these traditions, both Temazcal and Inipi, where the rocks, they share that wisdom, that original wisdom of the mother's womb, that interconnectedness where the child is not separate from the mother. The sweat-lodge is representing that return into the womb, right? It's round on top and then the round continues on the bottom, and then we are immersing ourselves into the womb of creation. The same with the ceremonies. In the Amazon tradition, it's a round structure, the maloka, supposed to be pitch black, like the sweat-lodge. And then it's the same as this remembering that original state of the child, of the interconnectedness, being a child in this creation, in this great creation, learning from the elements and from everything around us. And then with humility, learning how to channel that, how to awaken the heart through those experiences. And so then the healing comes through that, remembering oneself, this soul recovery, right? It's coming back into that natural state where the heart can balance the heat and the cold in our being. So I find that also quite a meaningful connection to what we discussed before and connecting to the healing on all levels. If you want to add something to that, Boris.
Well, yeah, I think so. Well, it's really interesting that in most traditions, be it in Peru or in Asia or wherever, or in Northern America, the essence of steam, or even like say Finland, the essence of steam is perceived as being a living substance, not unlike spirit or not unlike energy. And say in Shipibo language, we would say niwe to spirit, but as well niwe is air, and niwe would be steam as well. So like it's all niwe. So which is showing that it is basically a carrier of breathing, and breathing means life. So basically, it's a carrier of life.
Mm-hmm.
And same in Taoist tradition, for example, the rawest form of chi is the yin chi is basically steam. So like foggy energy, like the type of steam is perceived as being a particular type of chi, like the form which is still visible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it goes pretty much through all the traditions. The understanding of steam once applied being an agent of like energy, but as well of spirit realm is pretty much profound. And by and basically, the other thing we can see that the application of heat happens pretty much all around through most of healing traditions too. Like again, in Tibetan medicine, we all know, and in Chinese medicine, we know moxa bashan. If you know moxa, like applying heat to a particular point of the body, and there is like a whole map of these points of the body. It's very effective. Say treating depression, treating all different diseases. It doesn't have only the heat component to that. It has as well the component of plant, which is being burned to apply that. And it's not a coincidence because then plants are being activated through heat. And heat is being supported by the plants. Like, for example, in traditional sweat-lodge, we will find that the rocks are being activated with a particular incense. So incenses are requiring heat to be used in such way. And again, it's a particular vehicle of communication. It's not just a particular substance, it's a vehicle of communication because we breathe what is being burned and we breathe steam. So it's something we are actually ingesting,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a particular type of food in a subtle manner. This is being respected in most of the traditions, and I think it's pretty much widespread. Even though in lowlands Amazon, there is no point to heat up people because basically there is enough. It's quite warm over there, but topical application of heat is being used as much as in say southern India in the Ayurvedic tradition, say in Kerala. There is a concept of Svedana, and then Svedana is basically application of steam, medicinal steam, topically, because you don't need to heat the whole body most of the time, but like topically you would do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like Maxa, for example. And then another question is how is cold connected? So is there a similar attitude to cold? And I find that again, the connecting point is water. The water can turn into steam and the water can turn into ice, but it's still water. And so it's different expressions of the same energy, and water is life. Also, when in old times, I don't know if they still do that today, when they were checking if a person is still breathing, they would put a mirror to their nose and mouth, and there would be some steam that would come out. Also, in the cold, the steam is visible when we breathe. And so the cold also stimulates the inner heat if we approach it meaningfully. So I find that there is that connection where there is intensity, there is the extreme temperature, whether it's hot or cold. And then both of them are energies that can be converted into the spiritual light, into the spiritual awakening.
From what I see in traditions, the dualistic perception of the world shouldn't be taken judgmentally. Like it's very important to be able to see the world dualistically as yin and yang, as fire and water, as sun and moon, as Ida in Bengala, for example, with regards to the channels, because basically that's the second split after like the first is happening. Say if we take Taoist perspective, the first is happening once from nothingness, one is being born, and then from one two is being born. So this is a very important split in the epistemology of understanding of what's going on in the world. So the manifestation of heat is basically accompanied and as the figure and shadow is accompanied by the manifestation of cold, or manifestation of fire is accompanied by a manifestation of water. One cannot live without another. And basically both are constituents of our existence if you perceive it through this dualistic lens. Like if you take then the three-level lens, then we of course see body, speech and mind, and again pretty much widespread in all the traditions, this triad. But the appreciation of polarities is what is being learned through the knowledge of heat and cold, because this is the prime polarity we are learning. Like we can have lost all the senses, but this we're going to have. And it's very dramatic because this is the only thing which distinguishes the living from the dead. The living is warm, the dead is not. So that's pretty foundational, basic concept in understanding polarities. Of course, cold has the same right and the same importance as heat from the symbolic perspective. And again, like in Buddhist iconography, we would see wrathful and peaceful deities, very important. They come in both shapes. Like they come in, and that's quite important because we've got this attraction and we've got these two forces pushing and pulling. So that's what is being represented through that.
Yeah, the attraction, aversion, and ignorance, right? The three poisons. And
Pretty
then
much
the
so.
nectars is the ignorance becomes awareness, consciousness, and then the attraction and aversion turn into determination and generosity, right, as one example. And then you mentioned the body, speech, and mind. And so then again, there is the consciousness, the heart, right, the mind, the heart, and then the communicating point, the yin, the yang, and the learning curve between the two, right? The father, the mother, and the child. Like in these traditions, there's the mother earth, and then there's the father sun, the light of consciousness, the unconditional love, and then the child, which is our consciousness that we are learning how to bridge the opposites together through our own conscious existence.
Yeah, then from the perspective of three mandalas, so it would be mandala of wrathful deities, mandala of peaceful deities, and mandala of bliss. So the mandala of bliss is basically this connection, because bliss is basically what's happening when the connection is there. And that again has a very particular repercussion into the experience of steam and cold, because this blissful experience of connection, once awareness is there, becomes something of epistemological importance, because then we start to learn. Once we have awareness in bliss, then we are able to learn something very important.
And an important point here is that the bliss is not connected to pleasure in this tradition, but it's that bliss of the heart that unites the opposites, that unites the pleasure and the discomfort together and is able to remain open in the face of that. So that's a great point. We are approaching the completion of our talk. I think we're going a little bit over time. And so just to complete, people are asking, how do I connect more to the subtle realms? Meditation, nature, breathwork, martial arts, hot and cold therapy. So yeah, there are so many ways that we can bridge those complementary opposites in our lives together. And in these traditions, the first step is to get real with oneself and to see where am I living my life out of fear, where I get triggered and disturbed and lose my awareness in the face of emotions. And then, of course, it's useful to remember that original natural state and to engage in the remembrance practice. And so we have in our institute the evolutionary blueprint course online, which guides on that remembrance practice. Then, of course, there are the breathwork practices, and then we can take it to we can put it to the test. We can take it to greater experiences. But in my experience, it's essential first to make sense of one's own life, to establish that map of the inner landscape, and to see how the hot and cold is translated into daily existence, and then to start gradually developing that relationship with one's own emotions, with one's own ability to ride the waves of feelings and emotions. Then, of course, the contrast, cold bathing, hot and cold, and from what I've learned, to finish with the cold so the heat gets more rooted in the body. And then, of course, to experience that, or in the sweat lodge or in the sauna, but to engage with it more intentionally, and not just to do it like I can make it, I can do it in this macho attitude, but to gradually develop that connection. And yeah, there's so many ways, and some people do the Wim Hof and the cold immersions, and some people do it more through the heat. Some people engage more with the breath work. But even with the breath work, when we experience this reciprocal breath and the deeper cathartic modalities, we work with the Amazonian and Tibetan Dzogchen breath. And yeah, when people go into altered states of consciousness just through breath, through rhythmical breathing, and experience the catharsis or tetany, and again, all the body starts vibrating, there's hot and cold waves move through. And again, sometimes it's too intense for people to do right away. And in that case, we recommend to do it more gradually, more steady, learning how to maintain that anchor state of well-being, the original natural state, remain open, engage with the different experiences, with the shadow work, learn how to bridge the shadow and the light together. And so then it's a more gradual approach that we can start doing slowly through breathing, through contrast bathing. And even before engaging in ceremonies already, it's essential to make some sense of one's life. What are you after? What is the purpose of your life? What do you really need to experience in life? How can you establish that being as a priority in life? So if you want to add something to that before we complete, Boris. And also, I want to mention with Boris Institute, so Boris is in the US, so sometimes, it can be easier to access, and there's a very profound path that Boris has established in his institute, and we'll share the Steamology Institute website, so you're welcome to engage with that as well. And we've been establishing deeper collaboration with Boris and Steamology Institute, and I see that it's essential to create meaningful intercultural bridges today based on the essence, not just making a mush, but seeing how it can be complementary in the world that we live in today. So, Boris, you can share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course, and then replying to the same question without repeating what Roman already said. Connecting to the subtle realms, primarily, it comes from the longing for deeper meaning, and this is obvious. We are longing for deeper meaning, but there is no way to escape oneself, and it's basically a discipline of learning about oneself, about our real nature, about our nature as human beings. Individually and together. And what I can say, come to those who are teaching and try for yourself and test your teachers and try to go beyond words and concepts, because and beyond cultural artifacts, because that's what really gonna take you towards this path. And that if it is a real path, it's path of discipline and path of learning the most basic skills for us as human beings, the most important characteristics for us to be able to live together and to be able to find the meaning within ourselves. So, of course, Steamology Institute is doing our part of work on creating foundation of this knowledge accessible to everyone, and we as well are researching, and we are learning from everyone who's got their facet of knowledge. And we're going to share as well. We've got a link to our community. Steamology is a community of practitioners. We're going to have a link to Discord server where you can meet us and see what we've got there. But I think it's the beginning of an interesting journey further on with Roman and Paititi Institute to learn more in discussion and in practice. And I'm very glad that we have this opportunity and that everyone has assembled. And for those who are going to be watching or listening in the recording, again, very happy to have your attention. And thank you so much, Roman.
Thank you so much, Boris. Yeah, it's very inspiring. And just to add a little bit to your words, in all of these traditions, there is a reference to the cultivation of essential human qualities. So cultivation of patience and generosity to oneself, first and foremost, to experience all the ups and downs of life, and integrity, the determination, the focusing on the most objective perspective. So yeah, all of those aspects, they help to support the nature of the heart, the original state. And so within all of the traditions, there is this focus on noble human qualities. And that's first and foremost practice, I find, is how do I work through my disturbing feelings and emotions in everyday life? How do I relate to people around me? How can I communicate effectively what is on my heart and mind and bring that together? So thank you so much, Boris. Thank you, everyone watching. And we look forward to continue engaging and collaborating and finding deeper meaning and connection for this world to be a better place. Thank you so much, Boris, and everyone. Many blessings. Take care of yourselves and each other. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.